Good evening. Welcome to another developer interview here on Game Wisdom for our Perceptive podcast series. My guest tonight is an indie dev who's been working on kind of a variety of games similar to that of the Ace Attorney, kind of like that visual novel, detective, or investigation style. Their last game was Burden of Proof, and they're currently working on a sequel to that. And we're going to be discussing that and more for today's chat. So please welcome to the podcast from Robproductions, Matt Enad. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm good. Happy to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
Not a problem. And thank you again for reaching out and wanting to come on and talk about your game and so on. And as I say to all developers watching, if you are interested in coming on for a chat about games, game dev, or anything in between, please get in touch. But yeah, it is nice to meet you today.
Yeah, same here.
So, since you're first time on the cast, I always like to start things off with, can you talk a little bit about kind of like who you are and what is your background when it comes to game dev?
Sure. Yeah, as you said, my name is Matt. I come from kind of a computer science background, I would say, though I had a brief moment in art school around 2015. So a lot of those skills kind of transferred cleanly into game development. I've been making games for, I want to say, over 10 years since I was in middle school. And I started by doing game jams, like the Ludum Dare game jam. Did pretty well in those and had a lot of fun, like creating, like just little small experimental stuff, puzzle games, things like that. And that evolved into more convoluted games for Skyway in 2016, which I released on Steam. So back then it was like the Steam greenlight process, and that was a whole thing in itself. You had to get approved by a crowd in order to get your game on there, and yeah, I found that to be a big accomplishment. It was very rewarding, and from there it just kind of cascaded into what other games can I make, what genres can I push into, like how can I push the medium, even though I don't really think I push it in that unique of a sense. I kind of aim for more of like a mimicry of the AAA style, but on an indie scale. And that's just kind of been my philosophy going forward, like just tackling things that I find interesting, things I would love to play, that sort of stuff.
hmm So, you said that you started making games while you were in middle school. What was kind of like your, I guess, what was like kind of like your first game, or what did you like first work with when you were like making games?
So I used MIT's Scratch program, which if you've heard of that, it's like a block building kind of visual code, um, like game engine where you can just feed in sprites and then the blocks would make the characters move around on the screen. And I would make a lot of little um, silly things with that. And I just found that to be too limiting, as you can imagine. Once you hit a certain point, you're like, I gotta do something more with this. So that's when I stepped into Unity. That was around high school.
hmm So, besides kind of like the Phoenix Wright, that kind of investigation style game, are there any other genres that you like to work with or that you've made games in?
Yep, I would say the action adventure genre, stuff like that. I love games like Uncharted, Last of Us, all that sort of stuff. I play all the latest like Sony big releases. So I dipped my toes into that for games like Iron Reckoning, which I released in 2020. Um, and that was pretty fun. It was nice to get a different perspective on game development rather than going the visual novel route. Um, but I think I've been kind of mostly been pioneering a genre of visual novel combined with exploration. Um, it's something I don't see too much, like having a visual novel presentation mixed in with different types of gameplay elements. And I thought there was a lot of potential there and a lot of cool things to do with storytelling, like having your character see the different environments in 3D as you walk around. So you can see that in games like Shinogi Chess Club and Shinogi Chess Club 2. um, both of which kind of advanced what I started in Burden of Proof, and um, I guess added on like even more stuff with the puzzle mechanics, with the chess gameplay, and it was a lot to juggle, but I think it was worth it in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with kind of like the visual novel side of things, like I think I just interviewed another developer. I think their interview will probably be going up before this one, and we kind of discuss how the visual novel scene has really evolved. You know, some places where it's grown, some places where it hasn't. So I guess like to throw that question to you, as a developer's been working in the space and with the game that you made, and as well Burn of Proof and the one that you're working on now. Like, what do you see like from the inside in terms of, like the visual novel market? Is it growing? Is it stagnating? Like, where is it like from your perspective?
I think there's still potential. I think even games outside of the visual novel genre have kind of been taking inspiration from that, at least in terms of storytelling. Big things like Genshin Impact, for example, just include um, like very long segments of just visual novel presentation, and I think that's ultimately better for the for this type of genre. Um, it kind of allows it to branch out. Again, with what I've been doing on Burden of Proof and my new game coming up, which is called Burden of Truth, um, is to kind of add a different flavor to it, like to not just have it be a book that you read, but to be like a book like interspliced with more traditional gameplay moments.
Mm-hmm.
um, and that can definitely drive up the interest, the engagement, and I think it provides a better medium just for storytelling in general.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and as you mentioned with games like Ace Attorney and Danganronpa, like those series are very known for that kind of mix between the time to sit down read a story and then time to actually interact with the game. And I think
Yeah.
that's always like that. It's a very tricky balance because for one thing, like, and I guess this is something that's more of like a recent challenge, is the idea, the idea of stream friendly games. Like,
Mhm.
I play the games from Project Moon, so I'm used to stuff like Library of Runa, Lobotomy Corporation, where it can be, here's 20 minutes of two characters talking slowly, and then here's 5 minutes of combat, and then here's another 20 minutes of slow talking. And yeah, I think like the whole like streamer kind of like rise in that respect has been a very monumental change. I think how games are being developed and perceived lately.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it it can be very beneficial to have those moments of like non of not reading, for, as I said, storytelling, also for just keeping people occupied. Um, and in some ways, it is kind of, I don't want to say disappointing, but just like unfortunate that um, we don't have better vehicles for like showcasing those kind of stories. Um, as you mentioned, yeah, like I don't think that many streamers will tackle sort of like a full visual novel all the way through, unless they're giving like unique voices to all the characters
Mm-hmm.
and stuff like that. I always find that fun to watch, but
Mm-hmm.
uh, I don't know. I think it's pretty neat that games can just kind of get into that genre and kind of like expose it to more people, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like part of that challenge, and this is something that I've noticed like for myself, is like that balance between how gameplay intensive the gameplay section should be versus the story. Like an example, of this would be something like Sucker for Love. Have you played one of those games?
I don't think so.
Sucker for Love is kind of like visual novel dating meets Cthulhu. You're trying to date very hot versions of Lovecraftian gods, and essentially, like most of the game is done very visual novel style. You can decide, what items to use, which affect like the branching paths, and then for like the final kind of like big chapter, it kind of turns into like a quote unquote boss fight where you have to kind of figure out
Mm.
what do I do when these specific things happen? So it's probably the most gameplay intensive sections of the entire game. And the thing for me is that I really love those sections because I want to see more of the mechanic side. But that conversely, I could see like if you're playing a visual novel game for that story, you're not exactly want to stop the story and say, "Here's 5 minutes of life or death mechanics," and if you fail, you gotta restart the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I guess like for like your design standpoint in the games that you've played, like what do you think is like? Is there like a healthy balance between, I guess, like how like thrilling and intense the gameplay should be to go with the fact that this is a audience or this is a genre for people who aren't into like high speed, high reaction gameplay.
Yeah, I think there is a balance, and mainly one of the main things that helps with that is accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that having the tools for non-action players to be able to get past those action segments is really important. To take a direct example, I guess, from Shinogi Chess Club, um, it features chess matches basically in between the visual novel sections, and not everyone knows the mechanics of chess. I try to do my best to teach players how this specific variant of chess works in that game, but there's a limit at just what people can do. So things like difficulty settings, hints, good visualization during those segments, and just letting them take all the time they need, not having any time limits or anything that could put pressure on them. Um, and in Shinogi Chess Club 2, I added a button that just lets you skip the match. And I think that's a totally fair way to play. I think if you're there just for the story, then you might as well let them experience the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And going back to what you said like a few minutes ago about having like voice acting or like custom noise to every single character. In terms of like the presentation of visual novels, is I think another very interesting aspect of it. When we talk about like again, like I've been playing retro games and modern retro games for years now. So for me, all I need is just a simple dialogue box, chip tunes, and I'm ready to go. But with visual novels, I think we can also say something very similar to that of the point click adventure genre. There is that I think that I guess that expectation of having a presentation to it. That
Mhm.
just having two characters in the still images, like person saying like this, person saying like this, and all you're doing is reading dialogue. Like that doesn't seem to be as impactful these days. So I guess like again, like from your own perspective and your design, where do you think like presentation matters in terms of like visual novels or just like getting someone to check these games out?
I think story context kind of matters a lot in that sort of situation. So, as you said, like just having two characters standing next to each other talking in a room is not all that interesting. But if you add the context that they're on opposite sides of a courtroom and
Mm-hmm.
there is a murder trial going on and they need to figure out um, who the culprit is, suddenly there's a lot more interest in that sort of conversation. I also try to break apart the back and forth, as I
Mm-hmm.
like to call it. So in my stories, I will have moments where it'll cut away to something in the world, like say the audience reacting to them talking. It'll have effects on the screen, like the classic objection sound cue that you probably know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all that sort of stuff feeds into just making it less monotonous. Um, and then when you have the added benefit of gameplay segments, you can set up scenarios that are more interesting. Maybe conversations between groups of people, or conversations between a character and like something that they're interacting with, like a computer or an object that they're investigating on a crime scene. And um, just everything you can do to make it more interesting has really helped my games to, I guess, feel more important, feel more unique and different from um, some of the smaller projects that I see.
Mm-hmm.
I think like there's a lot of engines out there that kind of force you into certain ways of making the game because of the way that you have to code in those engines. I forget what they're called. It's like RenP and other visual novel engines where you basically put in a script and display sprites on a screen, and that's about all you get. You can swap out backgrounds, things like that. I opted to go with a full 3D game engine like Unity or Godot because it opens up a lot more possibilities. I mean, actually, for one, just the fact that it's in 3D is pretty different than a lot of visual novels that I see out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that I'm able to do a lot of interesting stuff with that fact alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the more interesting is we've seen in like the last like 7 or 8 years in terms of like kind of like more like editor engines like RPG Maker and Adventure Game Studio. Are developers kind of pushing those engines in like very unique ways? I mean, it seems like we've had almost like this like RPG Maker renaissance or like the last
Yeah.
like 4 years with like stuff like Fear and Hunger. I really enjoyed Final Profit. I know there's probably dozens of amazing RPG Maker games like released every day now. And it is again like that challenge. Again, like for people watching, I've been covering the game industry now for over a decade. So I have seen all the major trends. I've seen everyone repeat the same kind of games.
Mhm.
And trying to stand out has been one of the more challenging aspects, especially for indie developers. And when we look at genres like visual novel, adventure game, even RPG, there's just so many examples of it that you do need to figure out that way of how do you make yours stand out from, the entire, Steam or itch.io catalog of games.
Yeah, there's an insane amount of games released every day, basically. I I think my approach to trying to stand out has been with this sort of hybrid uh, genre, which I'm trying to make. I guess like mixing the visual novel and the different gameplay elements is one thing. I've also got ideas for maybe mixing different types of genres together as well. Like, let's say fighter combat, like jet fighter combat, along with visual novel elements, RPG elements, things like that. I don't know. It's really challenging, as you said, to stand out, but I think a lot of it comes down to just the execution, like how well you're able to present, and especially on things like Steam, where the banner images matter a lot, like how you advertise matters a lot. Um, I think there's a different art of like getting people into your game than there is of getting people to stay. Um, and that kind of that's hard to differentiate.
Yep. Again, like you're talking to someone who has played and covered what am I up to now? I think over thousands of indie games. And it is, I think, one of the blind spots for a lot of new and even sometimes established indie developers that there is that difference between how do I market my game to someone who's very well intimate with the genre versus how do I get someone who has never played this game, who has never heard of a visual novel or an adventure game or a platform or whatever, to even give this game the time of day?
Mhm.
And it does feel like two very different skill sets, and it's why I've really gone on to talking a lot more about like UI UX in games for like the past like 4 years. Because I've said this before, I just gave a presentation about this. Like, it doesn't matter how great your game is if everyone quits within like 90 seconds of loading up because they just got annoyed by it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is one of the things where having a hybrid genre can help a lot because, um, in terms of getting people to get interested in it in the first place. Because when you're able to take those screenshots of like, here's a sweet 3D environment, or like, here's a scene of some combat, um, obviously you don't want to paint a misleading picture of like what the game is, but um, if they're like genuine moments of like this is where a lot of the interest can be found in this game, then they can help sell copies, I guess. It's kind of the stuff that you have to do to um, survive pretty much.
Yeah. And it is unfortunate. Like, we're recording this right in of October. I just heard the news about the Concord developer being completely shut down. Like, in keeping with how timely things are about how difficult. And
Yeah.
it is very like this is definitely not going to be, I think, a happy year for the game industry. Like, I can't wait
No.
until what we see in 2025 at this rate. And it is very hard. And it's something I like to harp on when I talk to a lot of like students and people who are interested in getting in. That yeah, it's very fun and exciting to make games. It's very hard to actually make a living off of them. And
Yeah.
for a lot of smaller developers, there is always that kind of challenge of how far do I try to punch up? Again, like you meant, like with the visual novel genre, there are, again, you mentioned free engines. I know of Twine. There's a lot of them that it is just put text in, have a few still portraits, bing bang boom, we crank this game out. But to go above and beyond, there's always that risk and reward. Because again, I have seen games from developers who have gone up and they've done amazingly well, and I've seen games that they push everything into them, doesn't do well, and the studio closes within like a month or two after that game comes out.
Yep. It's not just this year, by the way. It's been happening
Yep.
since, I don't know, 2023, even before that. It's been a pretty bad decline. And for me personally, I got laid off from my software engineering position earlier this year. So I've been mostly just relying on what I can do on the game dev side of things while I try to figure that out. And that it's not been any better. I'll tell you that much. It's been kind of the just all around in the tech industry. So much competition, so much uh, closure of studios, and there, I, I don't really have much
Yeah.
to say about like why that is. I don't know, but it's affecting, I guess, every level of the industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I
Um,
think, and like to talk about like how much things have changed over like the past decade. I remember like seeing the developers who are like, yeah, I'll spend 5, 6, 7 years on a single title. I remember reviewing the developer was a Manful Garden, and he was like, yeah, I worked on for the last 8 to 10 years, on and off. And it feels like that particular like age of indie dev, it doesn't work anymore. Like you really
mhm.
can't afford to spend 5 to 10 years on just one single game. And again, like I don't, there's no like real like answer. I can't just like say,
Yeah,
oh, just do this and your game will succeed. I wish I could. I've said that many times, but it feels very much like this decade is going to really be, I think, a very like I think sobering point for game dev, not just in the indie space.
yeah, I agree. I think it's already been difficult, but
Mm-hmm.
it's going to get even more difficult as we get more projects coming out, more resources being put into just the top of the top of like the AAA experiences, and then even those, as we've seen, are starting to come down. So
Mm-hmm.
can only hope it gets better,
Yeah.
and can only hope that I guess, that it flows um, better into the indie space as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but having awareness of this stuff is a good first step. Playing more indie games is always a good way to just inject kind of resources into that space.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I guess speaking of like adding more to the space, one thing I want to ask you again, like for people who watched, everyone knows that I am not, as versed into the visual novel genre. I've played a few of them, but it's not, one of my preferred genres to play a lot of. From your own side of things, can you think of any other examples of like visual novels that have like pushed the medium or have done something like different or unique for people listening to us?
I would say Zero Escape has been a big inspiration. What was the first game called? 999, and
Mm-hmm.
then Virtue's Last Reward and Zero Time Dilemma. So those three games mixed visual novel with kind of like an escape room puzzle setting. Have you played it, by the way?
Yeah, you picked the one visual novel series I actually know of.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Um, that's definitely been a huge one. Um, the same creator made a new game series, AI: The Somnium Files.
Hmm.
Um, it's doing some similar stuff there.
Yeah. I think I played that when it was on Games Pass, but I did not finish that one.
Gotcha. Well, in that game, they do investigations, they do puzzle sequences, again mixed with a visual novel presentation, and they go full 3D. Um, so it's been one inspiration. Ace Attorney has also been going 3D as well.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think. There's some obscure ones that have more to do with like unique side mechanics, not necessarily like redefining the genre.
Hmm.
Um, let's say story wise, like Root Double Before Crime After Days is an absurd title, but that game definitely brings you on a roller coaster of emotions.
Hmm.
Um, Danganronpa.
Hmm. Yeah, I have like friends who really love Danganronpa. I tried one of them. Again, like Games Pass has been great for just getting more of these games like for me to play. I kind of like fell out of interest in it. I think it is again like going back to that whole idea when you're merging gameplay with visual novel that if the visual novel side doesn't interest you or you're not really invested in that, the gameplay doesn't quite, I guess, like hook you in that respect.
Yeah, it can be hit or miss. Definitely depends on the person playing.
And I can just hear there's gonna be a lot of angry comments down below when people say that they know that I haven't finished any of the Danganronpa games.
All right. I don't. Yeah, honestly, I don't know what the solution is from a developer perspective for that kind of scenario. Only that you try to make each section of the game as bearable as possible for the people that don't enjoy it. Try to have it as interesting as possible. I mean, that's something that I always try to do when I'm developing my games. Try to appeal as best possible to people that don't like certain parts of the game.
Hmm.
Um, and that sounds counterintuitive, but in a game with a hybrid genre, I think it's definitely an important step that you have to take.
Hmm. And as another like question about kind of like visual novel design and pacing, I want to ask you about like the length of these games. It's something that I brought up with the other developer interview, but in terms of creating like effective pacing for like a visual novel game for your own titles, like what are your thoughts or what is kind of like your philosophy in terms of like how long, how short, or how like well paced these games should be?
It's a big old. It depends. Some visual novels go on for 60 hours plus. I don't think I can bear that. Just from a developer perspective, I
Hmm.
can't. I can't handle that. Um, Typically, I aim for around 10 hours worth of content, which I think is enough for someone of my caliber with the scope that I'm able to create. Um, it's definitely challenging creating even that much in 3D because we're dealing with like full levels that have to be designed, created. Um, we're talking about music, unique soundtrack, characters, animation, story writing. This is all stuff that I handle by myself. I'm basically a one man show. So covering 10 hours of like unique content is itself like most of the challenge.
Hmm.
Um, in fact, many days I'm not even working in the game engine itself. I'm just doing like prep work, like story writing, character design. When you're dealing with like dozens of characters and animations, it's mostly content.
Hmm.
I do miss some of the traditional game development challenges. Uh, weirdly enough, I feel like I've tackled most of them. Like most of the programming aspects, like system design, things like that, porting, um, save load systems, serialization, all that kind of complicated stuff that I do in the code. Once you figure it out for one game, if the next game follows the same format, then all that code just slides right over. And I actually find myself missing a lot of the challenge of being able to code more stuff in my games. But
It's another one of those very like balancing acts when it comes to game dev. How much do you reuse? How much do you create brand new? Because again, like as an auditor I've spoken to a lot, Jake Briquette from Grey Alien, we've spoken so much about kind of sustainable game dev. And a lot of that is being able to reuse code, be able to reuse assets. Because again, you don't want every one of your projects to be a 3 to 5 year of you just starting right back at zero again to build a brand new game. And again, it gets at back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago about that kind of that challenge of how far do you try to punch up as a developer.
yeah,
Because you can do a lot. You know, if everyone had infinite time and infinite money, you can make whatever the heck you want as a developer. But again, it's that challenge of, is this really going to add to my game?
yeah. I watched their GDC talk, by the way. It's really good.
Yep.
I guess for me personally, when I do things like sequels, for example, obviously there's a great opportunity to reuse a lot and save a lot of time and energy just creating, or not even creating, just porting over models and characters, and people don't mind as much when it's a sequel. But for unique games, or the start of a series, it definitely is a lot of work. Like I want to make sure that it's uniquely identifiable. And while I might port over some small props and stuff like that, or include references to characters, things like that, I do try to make sure that there was like legitimate effort put into making it special.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. And I think that's a good segue for this next question, because as part of the introduction, you're working on a brand new game that's going to be Burn of Truth. So,
yep.
in terms of developing a sequel, like, what has been your approach to making a sequel? You know, do you go bigger? Do you expand? Do you iterate? Like, what has been like that for you?
I definitely go bigger. I go as far as I can take it. I really like revisiting characters and stories that I've already made because it enhances the emotional investment. I like to twist themes that you've already seen in the original game and kind of present it in a new way. So that's something that I did with Shinogi Chess Club 2. I try to advance all the plot lines in the story, and also tackle new themes and just put a new spin on what you saw in the first game, to add kind of like a different perspective to it. I'm definitely trying to do the same thing for Burden of Truth. A big difference here is that since it's so long since I released Burden of Proof, everything is like out of date in my eyes. Like the models are real janky. The animations, not so good. The textures, all that stuff, music. I wouldn't be satisfied just porting stuff over. So this is something I've wanted to do for a long time. Just like revisit that story, that world, and redo everything. So that's what I'm that's what I'm setting out to do. Just create all the characters again using the new skills that I've gained since 2018. Write all new music, remaster the locations just from the ground up, to be more interesting. And I'm sure anyone that looks at the screenshot comparisons between what I've shown so far for Burden of Truth, it is a world of difference.
Yeah. And with like developing a sequel out, are you expanding anything in terms of the courtroom side or that kind of gameplay loop?
I don't think I'm innovating too much. I'm just trying to handle it with more polish. Trying to, I guess, improve the clarity of the puzzles, of the interface, all that sort of stuff. Minor improvements, and I'm also trying to build a hint system. That probably is the most notable difference. And the hint system is just another way that people who uh, aren't that good at solving the puzzles can get through those parts in case they just want to see the story. Because it's really hard to do like a difficulty selector for that kind of game. Because it's not like you can just make the puzzles easier. So having a hint system and creating like a resource that you drain by using hints is kind of a nice design way to reward people that don't use the hints, but to still allow people to pass through those segments without needing perfect scores, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And trying to like make things more like approachable has been another like big aspect, not just for visual novels, but just in terms of games in general.
Yeah.
And it's hard, I think, for a lot of developers, even like for a lot of consumers, to like know their actual impact. I've played games that have had like very extensive assist modes and features like that, and a lot of people didn't even know they were in the game. Like it's like unless you do like something as apparent as Celeste. Hey, you can turn on infinite jumping at any time. People will sometimes just not even realize that's an option. Then they'll just be like, "Well, I didn't like your game, so I just stopped playing it."
Mhm. Yeah, definitely it's important to clarify those options for players. In some ways it's a good thing to hide it because it allows some players to tackle challenges that they might not otherwise attempt. Um, but it really depends on the game and the genre and the vision. But overall, I think it's been great that accessibility has been on the rise from AAA games to indie games. Um, Definitely for the past, I'd say, 5 to 10 years, it's been getting really good. So
Mm-hmm. Yep.
big thumbs up there.
And I think a lot of that has also been kind of how much the impact of indie development has really grown. Again, if you
Yeah.
compare, 2010 indie scene to 2020, it's completely different.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of that has just been the fact that even like very small indie games have that chance of being, caught by a major name in the space, major YouTuber, streamer, whatever. And we've seen this with the likes of Fear and Hunger, Among Us, what was it, a Lethal Company, and many others. So you really don't have like I think as a developer, you don't have that excuse anymore. Well, what if no one plays my game? Like, who cares? Because
Mhm.
you'll never know who will, stumble upon your game or if someone will write about it.
Yeah, you almost have, I would say, a responsibility to make it accessible, to make it playable
Mm-hmm.
um, by as big of an audience as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. I'm trying to think. As a quick time check, we're about 40 minutes in. Are there any design topics, anything like that, that you would like to discuss or you're interested in bringing up?
Story related, I think there's a lot of interesting things. Obviously, my games are mostly focused on story,
Mm-hmm.
um, so uh, having a lot of tricks there really helps out.
Mm-hmm.
I like to, as you said before about balancing, even when it comes to story design or like crafting a narrative, I think there is a lot of like a balancing act between exposition and interest, and just like when you get bored of something, you have to spice it up with an important event. And a good trick I think that I've kind of learned as I've been writing these games is that if I'm getting bored, like writing it, then I need to inject something that's going to generate interest.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some surprise, some twist, obviously one that fits within the structure of the story. Um, but it's definitely been difficult to come up with all these ideas. Again, one person. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so writing all this stuff alongside doing the art can get pretty crazy, just like in my head. So having a lot of like tricks and stuff to fall back on definitely helps with sustainability and just like keeping the production pipeline rolling smoothly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're trying to like set like the plot for a lot of these games. Like we've seen visual novel titles, they can go into like very dark or very like controversial topics. Again, the fact that you don't have to worry about actually like rendering them or showing them, you can just describe them in sometimes very gruesome or extraordinary detail can be enough. And it gets back to kind of like one like that challenges of telling like a mature story. I guess with your games, do you go for like very like mature plots, or are they kept, I guess, like relatively, I guess, like PG or PG-13?
I would say a kind of mix between like PG-13 and more mature
Mm-hmm.
titles. I follow like Ace Attorney as a guideline for that almost, or they deal with very like heavy-handed
Mm-hmm.
topics, but they don't always go into detail or delve into like the exact emotional distress that certain characters could face or things like that. So while it deals with subjects like crime and murder and um, uh, what else? My Shinogi Chess Club series deals with topics of like rebellion and personal freedom and overbearing security, things like that. How society evolves and how you challenge society's ideals, all that stuff is handled in, I guess, as much of a PG-13 way as I can handle it. Part of that is just to make sure that I'm not cutting off any audience members from being able to experience that. That goes back to needing to survive in the industry mainly,
Mm-hmm.
needing to cater to a wide audience.
Yeah. And that has become, I think, again, another aspect of indie dev is trying to reach as wide of an audience as you can. And I've seen plenty of games kind of struggle with that, and especially with like trying to get games onto console versus PC. Like we've seen plenty of console games that have just never made the jump to PC, and I always wonder if like those series that didn't survive, if they could have had that chance if they came to the PC market. And for a lot of indie developers, again, like as you were saying earlier in the conversation about marketing a game versus keeping people invested in playing it, if you don't do both of those, you'll end up either with like a very small fan base, or you'll get like that initial sales boost, and then no one sticks around, and then they're not going to be interested in whatever you're going to be doing next.
Yeah, and it also works the opposite way too. Like games that um, fail to strive on PC probably could do a lot better on console. Maybe depending on the audience that they target. Um, Maybe a company like Nintendo would not like the murder aspect of like Phoenix Wright, for example. I think they are on Nintendo platforms, but around that same kind of topic, you know, like if you deal with very heavy-handed themes, then you might have a harder time passing through like the console verification, which is all the more reason to, I guess, understand where your target audience is and think about like where your games could live in the future.
Yeah. And again, understanding what your audience is expecting out of your game is very important no matter what genre you're working in. And being able to, again, present that to someone, but also say, okay, if you've never played this before, this is why you should play my game, or this is what makes it interesting, is very important along those lines.
Yeah. Appealing to as many people as you can, definitely important. Appealing to specific subsets of people that are fans in genres that your game covers is also really useful because then you're able to share your game in those communities and perhaps open their eyes to something that combines multiple genres together. So I find that really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I guess as another question in terms of like developing like a visual novel style game, this is something I like to ask a lot of these developers. In terms of like your own like approach, Do you think about things from a gameplay first perspective or like a narrative storytelling perspective?
Man, it's a mix.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly from narrative, I would say. But there are limitations that I have in place. For my game specifically, I try to make sure that each section of game or each chapter, each like major portion of the experience has a little bit of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in Shinogi Chess Club, for example, I would make sure that there were at least like a chess match or two in every chapter so that you have that expectation going in. Um, you have a chess match every X amount of minutes, and then chess players are satisfied until they get to the next match, and so on. Um, and yeah, it's a balance. It's juggling all of that stuff together, um, but it also makes it formulaic, I would say, and
Mm-hmm.
that's not always a bad thing. But just having some sort of structure that you can rely on, where you go between those different styles of play, um, I think it creates an interesting experience. It's definitely more interesting in some ways than just having a flat out story presented over X amount of hours.
Mm-hmm.
I love visual novels, don't get me wrong, but uh, I just think there's a lot of potential
Mm-hmm.
for doing something more with them.
Mm-hmm. And that structure was always like one of the best parts of the Ace Attorney game. So you know
Yeah.
kind of how the beginning is going to be. You're going out to investigate, and kind of builds anticipation for the actual courtroom, the turnaround, and just kind of gives like that kind of framing. And having that framing can be very, while it is limiting in one respect, it is kind of good that you kind of have like that groundwork already done for you, or that blueprint for building like the next chapter and the next one and so on.
Yep. At the same time, it's kind of limiting because then you feel like you have to adhere to a certain structure, and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that creates a lot of writer's block.
Yeah.
Um, but in the end, it really depends on the vision, I guess. As I said before, just like what what is the unique idea for this game specifically, and how does each scene or each gameplay section feed into that and
Mm-hmm.
enhance it.
Yep.
Um, on the subject of Ace Attorney, I would say it's interesting what I'm able to do differently there than what Ace Attorney does. Um, Mainly with the way that they handle like investigations. Um, Here in games like Burden of Proof or Burden of Truth, I have the player walk around certain segments and explore the crime scene for themselves. And that's something that Ace Attorney doesn't do. They usually just show like one flat perspective of things and have you like click on different points of interest. But having the crime scene in 3D with the player experiencing it kind of helps them to gain like a different sense of what the situation is. Like it helps them to get into the mindset of how how the crime happened. It helps them visualize certain things better, and then you can pull upon that knowledge later on in the story. When you ask questions like, "How did this thing get from this point to this point?" and the player just already has an intuitive sense because they walked that path. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so those are the kind of like unique opportunities that I've been talking about, like that you get from being able to mix these genres together. Um,
Yep. And again, it allows you to provide something that's very different for the genre in terms of exploration, or like being able to wander around. Which I guess it takes me to another design question for you, because one of the other like pitfalls I see from a lot of developers, especially when they move in from 2D to 3D, is creating space for the sake of creating space. This notion that, well, I can make this 3D, so let me make this entire, the size of Texas, but there's
mhm.
only like three interactables on the entire map. So, just walk around for like the next 2 to 3 hours.
Yeah.
In terms of, I guess, like maximizing or making the space matter, what has been like your approach, especially again, working on a 3D style visual novel?
Well, if you've played a Davy Reedon game, what is it, Beginner's Guide and Stanley Parable,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that space sometimes that space is beneficial to the experience. That's just a completely unrelated side topic, but I don't think it applies too much to my games. But I just find it interesting. Thinking about the space as sort of like a realistic depiction of something that you would find in the real world. Sometimes there isn't always um, objects to inspect. Sometimes there isn't always things that fill up that space, and just making it reflect kind of like your expectation of what that space looks like can be very important. At the same time, yeah, you definitely have to fill it with interesting things that make a reason for having that scene in the first place. For that, it comes down to just littering it with with useful pieces of information. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the crime itself can even be designed around what kind of items would be placed on the scene for the player to look at. And then in cases where you run out of things that are related to the crime, I tend to throw in just like little funny moments
Mm-hmm.
or little interesting Easter eggs. There's a kind of a recurring joke that happens in my games where if you break out of the level, if you walk to a place where you're not supposed to go, the character will comment on it, sort of like breaking the fourth wall, um, and just saying like, "You got to get back into the level. Like this part is not designed." Um, I've actually been going kind of crazy with like the fourth wall breaks in some of my projects recently, um, and that is also a balancing act because you don't want to do too much of those. You don't want to
Mm-hmm.
have too much comedy as well in like a serious setting, like a courtroom trial.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I like to just let it loose, just like get it out of your system, you know, like um, that sort of stuff is fun. And I've definitely been inspired by a lot of other projects, like the Stanley Parable, in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Speaking about like the Stanley Parable, like another thing that we see from some visual novel games is of course having like multiple endings, multiple routes, things along those
Mm.
lines. Do you do that for your games, or do your games have kind of like a fixed narrative or a fixed path?
I typically do a fixed narrative, not because I'm opposed to having branching paths. I just think it's easier to make, and you get more benefit out of people spending their time playing. Because when you're developing content that is only seen by a fraction of players, it it's not like it goes to waste, but it feels like it's not used to its fullest potential. So creating content that is seen by almost every player kind of maximizes like the game's length. Like if I was to cut the game in half and just like move one half of it into a choice that you make at the beginning, then some people might not stick around to see that other choice.
Yeah.
So for that reason, I think it's most efficient for me to handle just a linear story. There are small deviations. I try to do alternate options for the puzzles. Like if you present something that's maybe not expected, or if you give an answer that's not completely wrong, the script will like work around that, try to work its way back to the correct course, or just like have a unique response to you for giving that wrong answer, and then bringing you back to the point of the choice. Um, yeah, I wouldn't be opposed to making branching paths in the future with different endings. It's just a lot easier to think about when it's linear, and also easier to think about in terms of like lore. When you do a sequel, for example, you
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't want to like negate the choice of a player from a previous project. Um, so that's definitely all stuff that I think about when I'm writing the stories.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's also getting like more work in terms of planning out the game. As you said, the nightmare of okay, which event is canon, because you'll end up possibly annoying half your fan base, depending on which one you
Yeah.
decide.
Yeah, some people get very passionate about that stuff. And that's great. Like I really love hearing people's thoughts. It would be, I would say, like a dream come true to see people analyzing my stories to a certain level, just like with the amount of details that I try to put into the world building, into the characters, and all that stuff coming together in the end is very exciting. So I'm really happy whenever I get to see someone, you say, like interacting with it on a level beyond just like this is what happens, but
Hmm.
this is what this means, and this is what the artist is trying to say, or like here's what the themes are, and here's what um, the underlying story is behind just the events that occur.
I am just about out of questions regarding storytelling wise. Anything else from you that you would like to bring up?
Um, Maybe just a small note about technology. So I mainly use the Unity engine to create these projects.
Hmm.
After the Unity controversy of last year, like a lot of other developers, I've been looking into making a switch. So on the side of making these projects, I've also been trying to prepare a workflow in Godot, which is an open source engine. Uh, with an open source engine, you can kind of like address problems without needing to rely on Unity tech support, which for me is kind of the biggest reason why you would want to go to something like that. Um, and I think it would just be really great for my games to have a home in sort of like a more stress-free environment like that. Um, but I did notice that Godot like wasn't fully suitable with like my workflow. Um, I'm very hopeful about like where it can head, and that's why I've been trying to create like pull requests and have idea discussions in the Godot community to try and get it to bridge the gap more closely with what I'm familiar with. Um, so from a programming perspective, that kind of is where I've been getting some of the challenge back, rather than just like endlessly creating content. I'm like creating an environment for my games to sit. And one day I would hope to have like a suite of packages that I can just like deploy into Godot to create like reusable components, so that making the kinds of games I do becomes a lot more easier. And maybe not just for me, but for other people that want to make these kinds of games. Um, so I've already been experimenting with creating packages for Unity, and would definitely hope to continue that into Godot.
Sounds good. And again, anytime that you can make kind of like the dev pipeline easier in that respect, it helps everyone else as well in
Yeah,
terms of being able to kind of get to the heart of what makes your game work.
yeah. Both engines, Unity and Godot, are built on the backs of giants, I guess, built off of a lot of technology that's already been figured out. Um, and it's really a great privilege to just be able to build upon that, to have
Yep.
to be able to make pull requests and to kind of shape it to suit your own needs, and to find that those needs are the same as other developers who want to use the engine. So it's really exciting stuff coming in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And speaking about the future, I think that is a good way to kind of like segue into like the final part of our conversation. Talk a little bit about like what's coming down the line from you. So, as I said, we're recording this just a few days from Halloween in 2024. So, for your next game, you have that currently set for 2025. Is that right?
Yes. I hope to have a demo out in early 2025, which will feature the prologue segment of Burden of Truth. And that'll just give everyone a taste of what the game is like, and how it's improved from the last game. And then hopefully just a few months later or sometime in 2025, I will have a official release, and that'll be the rest of the game, which will follow up on all the storylines that I built in 2018. So this has been a long time coming, and it'll be pretty big when it releases. Um, but it's very exciting stuff. Beyond that, I've got tons of ideas for other projects, and I would like to try out other genres besides the visual novel hybrid experience thing that I've been building. That's pretty much all I'll say concretely at this point. But there's a lot of neat stuff that I would love to build with Godot, with different types of games, and um, yeah, I'm just getting started.
Mm-hmm. And I guess like as another kind of like follow up on that, have you participated in any of like the again like same runs like festivals beyond like Next Fest? There's a lot of smaller ones, ran ones. Have you done any of those or planning to do any of them?
I have not. Do you have
Oh,
any that you recommend?
oh, jeez. I know there's plenty in terms of like adventure games. There's of course Ludo Narracon. Again, like I'm sure there's like a few dozen like coming up. I think right now, as I was just looking before we started, there's a difficult games mini festival going on. It seems so.
Mm.
Again, they are certainly out there, and they're always great ways. I think for developers kind of like pull their, I guess like pull their clout and their recognition for everyone involved.
Mm. You'll definitely have to look into those.
Hmm. So obviously, Burn of Truth and so on are available on Steam, and I'm assuming on itch. Have you thought about or doing any plans of doing console releases, or is that kind of like out of scope at the moment?
Uh, I have tried to get some of my games on the Switch, but being a one-person studio, it's a lot more difficult than you might expect. So,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe it's exactly as difficult as you might expect. Um, so that has not been getting much motion recently, but I will always keep trying. For now, I think Steam and Epic Games Store is probably going to be the home of most of my games.
You mentioned like working like doing like a more action heavy game or more like action for like, your next title. Is any other genres that you would like to work with in the future?
Yes. I released a game in 2020 called Iron Reckoning, which was basically kind of like semi hack and slash, more just like combat focused fantasy adventure. That kind of style of game I think is really interesting, where you just go through a story, uh, still touching on some of the like narrative elements that I love to include, but just not having any visual novel elements, just presenting the story in cutscenes. That's really interesting. I've got ideas for having that gameplay in sort of like an arena setting, where you do like an RPG upgrade loop, um, with a focus on just like getting stronger and
Mm-hmm.
developing different mechanics, and also framed around a unique story. Um, and I would like to touch I guess the jet fighter genre. Is that a genre? The
I have like
combat.
there's like arcade flight sim. I know there's a few of
Yeah,
those out there.
I've been really inspired by Ace Combat recently and games of that sort. I think there is a lot of potential there, and I'm getting pretty excited. Maybe trying to develop a project of that sort. Um, there is a lot of really interesting things that you can do with that sort of setting, um, both from a narrative perspective and from a gameplay perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know. It's all just ideas at this point, but that's where my mind's at.
All right. And I guess like final question then before we like wrap things up. For the audience listening, any other like visual novel games or anything original or interesting in the space that you would recommend them to check out?
Um, I would say anything in the courtroom genre, court trial genre. Uh, what is out there? Aviary Attorney. Paper Perjury is coming soon. That's a pretty neat indie game that I've seen. Ace Attorney, Danganronpa. Can't think of much else off the top of my head, but
All right. So, to kind of wrap things up for our conversation. So, first question for you, Matt. In terms of social media, anything you like to mention, promote, whatever.
Yep, I have a Twitter and a Blue Sky. It's at Robproductions on both of those, I believe. Or you can go to my website. It's robproductionsgames.com, and that is that in itself has been a project that I coded in TypeScript. But that has all my links to my games, to my social media accounts. I've got a Discord server. If anyone wants to hang out there, always welcome. And otherwise, I would just appreciate anyone who's listening to check out my projects. Just search up Shinogi Chess Club, search up Burden of Proof. I think you have to type Burden of Proof game Steam because it's such a common term that it takes a few steps to get there. But maybe in the future it'll be less.
All right, and I guess then the final question for you, Matt. Do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans watching to take us out?
Just thank you so much for playing. It's been an honor being here, and always wishing you best of luck with your channel, with your reviews. I think what you're doing is really awesome, and I really appreciate the time you've given me to talk about my development process.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you again for coming on, and best of luck with finishing the game and whatever you have next.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to wrap things up for our conversation today. You'll find links to everything Matt mentioned down in the description. Again, if you are new to the YouTubing stuff, check out all my books on design. I don't have any adventure-style ones yet, but who knows, maybe in the future there'll be a few of those. And again, if you are a developer working on a game or just want to talk game dev, I am always looking for guests for this series, so please get in touch. So again, thank you so much, Matt, for coming on, and hopefully we can do another chat in the future.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. So for you folks watching, thanks again for tuning in. Come back for daily discussions on game design here, and on Game Wisdom, where you examine the art and science of games. Until next time, everybody, have a great rest of your night.